How are you all this evening? Welcome to Georgetown University Law Center. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, especially on an incredibly wet evening. And thank you all for your patience as everyone struggled to get through Washington, D.C. traffic. For those of you who don't live in D.C., Washington, D.C. traffic involves complete stopping when it's raining, right? Because we can't go, and so those of you who didn't plan for that, thank you for getting here, albeit a bit later. I'm Matt Kavanaugh from Georgetown's O'Neill Institute on National and Global Health Law. We are really happy to host this debate and really excited to do so tonight. A number of folks are in the audience and in the room from a variety of different backgrounds, including folks welcome from the Global Congress on Intellectual Property in the Public Interest. And so thank you all for coming. And this is an event that we've been planning for quite some time and really being thoughtful about what does it mean to bring new ideas, complicated ideas, and ideas to Washington that don't often get heard. And so what we're really glad about and appreciative of the folks who are here is to kind of air some of the debates that we know happen around the world, but too rarely happen here in Washington on these issues. And so with that, I will be quiet and introduce Paul Ohm, who's the Associate Dean here at Georgetown University, to welcome you on behalf of Georgetown.
Welcome, everyone. I wanted to echo Matt's warm welcome on a not-so-warm night. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. I'm here on behalf of our Dean, Bill Traynor, who had another event, but wishes he could be here. I've been an Associate Dean forever, 2.5 months. And this is my first kind of decanal greeting I've ever done in my career, so thank you for making it a wonderful one. I feel like I donned the thing. I think it's a wonderful event for me to use to kind of try out my decanal lungs because I am a cyber law scholar. I focus on information privacy law and technology law, so I'm ecstatic to be kind of among my tribe, or at least the tribe right next door. The Global Congress is an amazing thing, and I'm so proud that Georgetown can take a part of it. I think this debate in particular, does more IP help or hurt global health, creativity, and development? Of course, the answer is yes, but I think it's a wonderful thing to have this debate here because it does reflect the values that we think we try and instill in our curriculum and in our student body here at Georgetown. Let me just highlight a couple of things by way of advertisement. The O'Neill Institute is one of the 4 partners who organize the conference. The O'Neill Institute speaks to the kind of global focus that we really emphasize. Number 2, we are technology crazy at this law school, and that means we think about the possibilities and the perils of the embrace of evolution of new technology, and we're so glad that you're engaged with that in a very deep way. Number 3, this is a law school that has a motto that we talk about all the time, and that motto is, law is but the means, justice is the ends. And so it's so appropriate to have a global Congress on not just intellectual property, but the public interest within our 4 walls. So we welcome you as kind of kindred spirits in that sense. And lastly, it's really difficult sitting in the shadow of the Capitol to do anything more than just respond to the latest headline and to think about the latest tiny, tiny, tiny little picayune issue. And so it's really wonderful that this group can come together and have a panel called The Big Debate. And an opportunity to talk about the big issues, and to have eminent scholars with us, but also people from industry and people from civil society. And the ground rules, as I'm sure the moderator will talk about in discussions like this, are always to kind of elevate the debate, to find the space, to find the time to talk about these things in the kind of big, capacious, impossible ways that we can do in settings like this. So once again, I'm going to get out of your way and learn along with the rest of you, but welcome to Georgetown, and thank you so much for being with us.
And so with that, I will simply introduce your moderator for the evening. So Ben Cashton has agreed to join us as moderator. He is the producer of a number of different television shows, including The Big Debate in South Africa, which he produces for SABC and also for the BBC. And so we're just really honored to have him here to bring us an interesting, engaging, lively debate on these issues. So Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Associate Dean. I see you have a position on the topic being debated tonight. You wouldn't like to perhaps have a 5th chair there so you can join the... Okay. Thank you so much. The Big Debate is the name of my TV show. Actually, previously I worked for the South African government in the presidency, and then moved to the media and set up a show called The Big Debate, which has been running for about 10 years in South Africa. It's a town hall debate show. I won't be putting in a claim to Georgetown or to the Global Congress for the use of my IP. I'll share it readily. I arrived in the States with a bit of a cold, and I spent a few hours in bed, and I had some time to watch TV in the States before coming here, and I thought I'll do a bit of a scientific experiment whilst watching TV. Some of you may be familiar with a film called Super Size Me, where there's a scientific experiment involving McDonald's hamburgers, and a gentleman eats McDonald's hamburgers for a while and sees what effect it has on him, on his body. So I thought I'd do the same, but this time it had to be with television shows. So I watched for 2 hours CNN and listened with my left ear, and then I watched for 2 hours Fox News and listened with my right ear, and then tried to see what sort of medical effect it would have on me, hoping that I'd get some treatment if necessary at the end of the day. And I can tell you for sure that the two halves are completely unable to hear, listen, communicate. I'm completely bifurcated at this point. So I don't know if that says something about the society we all live in, the society that you guys certainly live in, but I'm hoping that the big debate today will be a listening, a sharing, a searching for common ground, not a bifurcating into two camps and then not being able to find each other. That's definitely the idea of the discussion today. We're talking about intellectual property. At the most common sense idea, and I can only talk about common sense because I'm definitely the least qualified here to talk about intellectual property, but perhaps it helps to just remind ourselves what we're talking about. I have an idea. I try to bring that idea to be useful, to implement, to bring about something in society, and I want to own it. I want to have property. I want to benefit from it. I presumably am keen to make money out of it, and that might be good for me, and it might be good for others if I take that money and I use it beneficially, profitably, in order to reinvest in producing something good, whether it's music, whether it's life-saving medicines, and so on. That could be the case if that money is reinvested. In a worst-case scenario, it could be the case that intellectual property gives me the opportunity to make money out of something which other people want and need and should be benefiting from. And I think we could probably all agree that much, that there's both an opportunity for something positive for me to enjoy if I have intellectual property, and a risk and a danger and a threat that it is worthwhile including lots of other people in a conversation about. You'll tell me if I've gone too far and you can't even agree with that little opening moment. But I want to go a little bit further and suggest to you that then there could be two clashing visions, of course. There could be a vision which says it's all too much. It's all a license for exclusivity, which is unwarranted, and some would even say a monopoly on the production of things which are sometimes public goods, such as life-saving medicines, and intellectual property gets in the way of those medicines reaching people. We know these arguments. On the other hand, it will be argued, I think it will be argued, that it's an incentive. Intellectual property, of course, is an incentive for production. Without being able to enjoy the benefits, the profits, there will be no opportunity to put something back into recreating. So those are two potentially clashing visions. I hope that we won't just have a clash of visions. I hope that what we'll do, and this has been the brief from Matt Kavanagh and others, is to ask where to from this point, where there is a clash, but there are lessons that we've learned from countries where we've had to look at pricing, we've had to look at issues around access, we've had to look at issues around who produces and who benefits. So the question we'll be trying to focus in on is, as we move forward, more IP or less IP? Ratchet up or ratchet down? Or is that the wrong question? Is there a point at which there's a nuance that's missed by posing the question in that way? So I want to properly introduce the panel, and I will refer to a few notes. And joining me to discuss more or less IP for development, or is IP, increased IP protection good for development? and you're in a different order to my notes. First of all, Joe Damond, who is the Executive Vice President of BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And previously, you worked at a number of industry companies, including Pfizer and pharma. And previously, you were a negotiator for the US Trade Representative. Then we have Patrick Kilbride, who incidentally also was in the office of the US Trade Representative, but now is at the US Chamber of Commerce and is the vice president of a part of the US Chamber of Commerce called the Global Innovation Policy Center. And previously, you were at the US Trade Representative's office during the Bush administration. Then we have Ruth Okediji, who is a distinguished professor of law at Harvard Law School and a specialist in international intellectual property. And Ruth was appointed in 2016 by former Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon to the high-level panel on access to medicines. And then we have, last but not least, Gail Krikorian, who is currently with Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, where she heads the policy unit responsible for the Access campaign. And Gail has previously advised the European Union on treatment and has been a long-time treatment activist. We have in the audience academics, activists, lawyers, and other random people who are joining us. People very concerned with everybody. I think that's what brings us all together. From India to Argentina, from South Africa to the United States. I think we have people from all over the world. Thank you for coming and welcome to you all. Now, one small footnote is a personal one, which is that I live in South Africa, which is right now the most unequal society on the planet. From every statistical source, it's been confirmed, the United Nations, the World Bank, that during apartheid, South Africa was the second most unequal, but we are honored to have overtaken Brazil to now have become the most unequal society on the planet. So in South Africa, and you'll hear me giving a couple of examples of South African cases as we have the discussion, there's a huge issue over access to medicines, whilst at the same time, a pressure to grow the economy and ensure that everybody benefits from that growth, and that's attention. So I've kept a keen eye on access to medicines because of the inequality. But I've kept a keen eye for a personal reason, which is that I use a medicine, that on a daily basis, I take a medicine produced by the private sector. And having that be a personal experience for me has given me food for thought about any political or ideological view I may have. So I take a Novartis pill that costs quite a lot of money. I don't pay for it. It's paid by a British health insurance company called imatinib or Gleevec, and many of you will be familiar with it. So if any of you suggest to me that those medicines should not exist, or that the majority of the population in the country that I come from should not have access to medicines, I'll be keeping a keen eye on you. Now, maybe we can start without rehearsing the positions that I tried to outline. Maybe we can think aloud about a situation, a country that challenges us to think about the future. And I thought China would be a good place to start. And I hope you're all happy with being thrown into the deep end. I think I did warn most of you that there would be a thinking aloud aspect to this debate. And others, I hope, other voices will join in during the course of the discussion. China has a population approaching 1.5 billion. It has a new middle class, or a rising a number of people in excess of 500 million who have risen out of extreme poverty, according to the definition used by the World Bank and the UN and other bodies. And access and demand for different kinds of medicines is definitely there. It's strong, it's evolving. It's an opportunity for pharmaceutical companies, definitely. It's a market for pharmaceutical companies. It's a social challenge in the sense of getting medicines to an extremely large society. So I want to ask you to think aloud for a few seconds without trying to be experts and have your fact books on China at your fingertips, but just what's your sense, Joe, Patrick, perhaps, and then we can go to Ruth and Gail. More IP in China or less IP protection in China as we look at the future, the needs of the society and the opportunities?
Okay. You want me to start? Well, thank you,
Go
Ben,
ahead.
and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I have spent a little bit of time in China talking to officials there about this question. One thing you should know about China, in addition to the problems or the issues that you just indicated, is that China's identified biotechnology as one of 7 strategic sectors that they want to develop. And the government's pouring literally hundreds of billions of dollars into growing their own biotech sector to develop their own medicines industry. And a lot of this involves collaboration, cooperation with our companies. In fact, Bio has a big convention every year. Last year it was in Boston, and something like 500 people from China came to that. The Chinese answer, evidently, is more IP, because China's strengthening its IP laws, has over the last decade, and particularly with respect to medicines has been. And of course, that's because they want to develop their medicines industry, and they don't. And they've determined that in order to do that, and in order to get the incentives to invest in that, not just by the government, but by the private sector. There's some big Chinese funds now. And actually, Hong Kong just opened a market, a financial market this year for small companies who don't even have any revenue yet. And those companies are looking to invest in China. They won't invest unless there's IP protection for their investments, because otherwise, other than that, they won't get a return. So, but to the issue of access to medicines, let me just say this. 2 things. One thing that China has done also over the last decade is put in place a much more comprehensive public insurance program. So whereas 10 or 15 years ago, there was probably less than 100 million people covered, now most of the Chinese population has access to that insurance. It's uneven, and it's by province. And so through that insurance program, access to medicines are being improved, particularly in the countryside. There's still a long way to go. The final point is, with respect to whether China can afford to pay for medicines, these medicines, whether it be from the West or locally. I just point out that China has $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. What they spend that on is a question of Chinese priorities. So I don't think that they're a resource-poor country. It's a question of whether they expend those resources and to what purpose.
So you say the position of China is more IP, is be clear about protecting IP. It's a position you support. Do you think, Gail or Ruth, will we fail to learn some of the lessons of other developing countries if we make that our position without further thought and interrogation?
Well, I don't know what you call our position, but so what I can say, China is an interesting case because we hear a lot about it, and usually it's to say that China doesn't respect patents, when on the contrary, they actually do. They're reinforcing the protection. They are the country that is granting the biggest number of patents, worldwide, like 25% more than the US, which for us, MSF, providing treatment to people is pretty concerning, because China is also the country that is like the biggest producer of raw material for medicine. So, we very recently won an opposition against the patent in China on sofosbuvir, an hepatitis C drug. But we're concerned about seeing that development, because as you just said, China is also injecting a lot of public money in biotech and other, medical sectors. So that means that, and they clearly have the means to support research in a different way, open research, collaborative research, push the sharing of knowledge, what needs to be done now to boost medical research, instead of copying that old model where you go through monopolies, protection, more and more protection. we are right now in Europe and in the US witnessing, that we are going to eat the wall. We cannot sustain that model anymore. So of course, seeing China going in that direction with all the means they have is pretty concerning for us.
So let's just clarify for everybody. You said you've just won a case against the patenting of a drug, sofosbuvir.
Yeah, sofosbuvir, yes.
Yeah, which is a drug for hepatitis C.
Yes. Hopefully, because of the opposition, it's possible that 9 million people, may have access now to that product, and they couldn't with the monopoly situation. So.
And it was a drug company. Which drug company was patenting the drug?
Gilead.
Gilead. Okay.
Yes.
So, and you're happy to have won that battle in China because now cheaper versions of the medicine will be available, or it puts the state or organizations like yours in a position to negotiate with the company to lower its prices.
To access generic medicines.
To access
have
generic
a competition mechanism, bring the price down.
So, Patrick, can you reflect on that? Gail says that's a good thing, that patent was defeated in China because now more Chinese people who suffer from the liver disease, hepatitis C, will now have access to amazing new drugs developed by this drug company.
Sure. Well, if we want to understand this dynamic, I think it's important first to take a step back. 100 years ago, a patient in China, whether they're suffering from hepatitis C or some form of cancer, would have access to neither Gleevec or sofosbuvir because they didn't exist. 50 years ago, if they did exist, or whether or not they existed, that same patient wouldn't have access to these types of medicines because the Chinese government was so insular and restrictive that a product from abroad wouldn't have been let in. Today, thanks to an opening by China to the world, we've seen both a tremendous engine of growth engaged, and we've seen China engage in the world trading system in a way to make those products available to Chinese patients. Products that wouldn't exist unless international companies made an investment over a long term, decades in some cases, to bring a new drug to market involving billion-plus dollar investments. And these companies bring these drugs to market because they test many, many different forms of medicine. When they find one that works, they go to the expense of testing it, commercializing it, gaining regulatory and marketing approval to it, and then delivering it to patients. And in return, they're given a limited term of exclusivity, a monopoly on a specific solution to a technical problem, not necessarily the only solution to a technical problem, but that allows them to recoup enough of that investment so that they can then invest it back in the pipeline and bring the next successful drug to market.
So the argument's clear. Ruth, if I can summarize it, China in a way, and maybe some other countries, Egypt is another country that now doesn't currently have a patent for the same drug, if I'm not mistaken, want to have it both ways. They want the drug to come, this is Patrick's argument, they want the drug to come after having been developed in the United States or elsewhere, but they don't want to pay the full market price for it, some of which would have gone on research and development. Is that a fair argument?
I mean, so let me just say that I think that we may be framing the problem in a much more simplistic way than is the case. I don't think it's more or less IP. I actually think different IP is what we need to be thinking about. I also think that the problem with access to medicines is that you have a public good. You have essentially human lives that depend on having access in order for them to reach their fullest capabilities. You have a business that trades in life. And what we have not done is identified the contours of a business model that justifies high prices and therefore limits the numbers of people that can access or receive treatment. That's the challenge. So Is Joe right that China's opening has made life better for many Chinese who would otherwise not be able to access the medicines because their government restricted imports? Absolutely. I mean, there's a sense in which access starts with having physical access. It's hard from a human perspective to answer the question, what's better? To see the food on the shelf and not be able to afford it, or to have no food at all? That's a hard question. And I also want to say that while I think property rights are important and they reflect in many ways both incentives and reward, I think it's fair to say that no one gets a patent on something that they began at ground zero with. Everyone is building and absorbing and being subsidized at some level. And there's this question of the way in which pharmaceutical pricing is done that we have to examine. Now, the patent monopoly certainly exacerbates that, in some ways justifies it, but can we come up with a model in which private industry is both incentivized, but human lives are not the cost of that incentive?
So let's try and have a conversation then, if we have enough information at our fingertips, about the pricing in relation to the investment, using the example that Gail has given us here with the hepatitis drug. And maybe we've got almost enough information. I've got an LA Times quote I could read you. But help us a little bit, Gail, and then we can come back to Joe as well. What do we know about Gilead and its production of that drug, where it got the technology from, how much it put into it, and how much it's already made out of selling the drug in other parts of the world?
Well, yes. I mean, it's one of the many very interesting examples to not illustrate what you're just talking about, because, I mean, and that's the kind of like huge part of the reality that is always missing until now in the discussion, is that subsidies and public funding and all sort of funding that are not coming from the private sector to fund medical research are huge. And we're always doing as it was not existing. So we're talking about something, but we're ignoring what is actually the reality of the process of the development of the product. So in that case, we have a scientist coming from the public sector who is building up a biotech, finishing to develop the product, selling the patent to Gilead, who is buying it for $12 billion. And then, having the monopoly, being in a position to ask whatever price. And there's been this interesting inquiry from the Congress, the Senate committee in the US, showing exactly how Gilead had been building up the price based on really how much they could, ask for. And it's really in line with that recent quote from the CEO of some company who was saying, it's a moral requirement to just make as much money as you can and ask for the highest price as you can if you can. So that's the logic behind that system. So I can understand that, that some people do that and that's their choice. But I'm just saying, if we want medical research, and we consider all the public funding that is invested, maybe we need to think in terms of cost effectiveness for that public funding. What is the public return for the public investment? And as a medical organization, I'm thinking, if you do that, you apply such a system on, telephone pieces, that's okay. That's maybe unfortunate, but not costing life. We're talking about medicine, so it's an old, totally different problem.
Let me also say that it's important for us to have this debate because so often it's about patents or non-patents and private versus public. But the nuances are real, right? So there's a question about the way in which the patent incentive works to direct research and development. What is it that makes a company decide that they're going to research in a particular area, right? I mean, why don't we have drugs that effectively treat malaria? Right? Why don't we have drugs that treat diseases that affect only a small portion of the population? I think that the human aspect of the patent system and the way in which it operates in the private sector is something that we as a society and as a global society really need to begin to take very seriously. Because it's not, it's the pricing for the diseases that we already have medicines for is a huge issue, and there are clearly ways around that. There are different business models, and there are huge subsidies that should receive some discount. I mean, everybody knows that pharmaceutical pricing is science and art. It's not, it's not all just about recouping the costs of R&D. But there's a distorting effect. Right? My sister happens to be a clinical pharmacologist, and her job is to figure out if an elderly person has 3 diseases, which one's going to kill them first. Is it high blood pressure, is it diabetes, or is it, a heart murmur? And in deciding that, her job is to sort of identify what medication is going to do the least harm to any one of those 3 aggravating diseases. So when you think about someone picking between what, do I feed my child, do I buy this drug? Do I take half the pill today and half tomorrow? And the consequences for global public health, the morality of the system has to be something that we begin to engage with. And it's not just a morality about do we issue the patent, do we not? It's also about what does the patent do by way of incentivizing particular forms of research and R&D in markets where we know there's going to be a high return versus those markets and those diseases that afflict millions of people, but for which no drug exists. So I think it's more than Joe's point of, China opened up and, China's investment. There are other things that actually, I think, affect the global picture of access to medicines.
Yeah, you want to respond to that, and I also want to challenge then the two of you to respond, I think, to I want to sort of capture the essence of what both Ruth and Gail have referred to, which is, are there limits to intellectual property other than the one that you guys have both acceded to? So you've both said that patents expire, and that's right, that they should expire. Are there other limits that you guys are both comfortable with, based on the morality issues that we're hearing, that could relate to price? Should there be a limit to how much money you should be able to make out of a patent because of the fact that then your price is denying access to a large section of a population? Are there limits that should be imposed for other reasons, based on an emergency situation or something like that? Give us a sense of what limits you guys would be comfortable with.
So there's a number of things I'd like to respond to. I'll try to be as concise as I can in doing this. One thing is to just sort of talk about how the structure of biomedical research has changed in the last 15 or 20 years. Our organization represents about 1,000 little biotech companies, and that's maybe a half to a third of the ones that are in this country. There are about 7,000 clinical projects in the pipeline right now in all sorts of disease areas. 90% of clinical trials fail, which means that that people that are investing, what the movement to small companies has meant is that there's a lot of private investment going into this, and people are making a lot of bets on potential drugs that will fail. So that's why the IP is so important, because you're not going to make a very sizable investment and probably fail unless you've got some return at the end of the day. With respect to public research, and we're saying there's a lot of public money going into this. I just want to put this in perspective. The NIH, which is the 800-pound gorilla in terms of public research, and most of that's basic research. It's not research into medicines. It's research into the causes of diseases, which is very important and which is a public good. They spend $30 billion a year. The private sector invests $150 billion a year in new drugs, not in basic research, in new drugs. The drugs are being developed by the private sector. And yes, NIH is critical. We support the NIH to the early stage knowledge about what causes a disease. But then when a person has an idea to develop their knowledge about what causes a disease and actually wants to develop a drug, they don't go to the NIH for that, or the European Union. They have to go to the private sector to finance that. And as I said, the multiple is about 5 times what's being spent by the public sector. Okay? With respect to, so I think these are just some of the realities of the marketplace that we live in. With respect to it, and then finally, let me just say that, of course, with respect to before I get to your second question, you point out these are time-limited issues. Okay, so the patent exists for 10 years. And by the way, there's other products in that disease area, unless it's a true breakthrough in a disease area, that compete with that product. It's not a complete monopoly, but it is monopoly for that molecule. It lasts for 10 years. So this is a time-limited issue. I mean, for 10 years, society has to figure out how to ensure that the resources are sufficient to get access to people for this new medicine before the rest of the world, before that product becomes available to the rest of the world. And if they err too much on the side of making that drug available too soon, then the drug won't be developed in the first place. Where is exactly that period? I don't know. I can tell you this, that the current system does do a good job of getting new molecules out. I mean, the private sector is doing its job, or the biomedical research sector, these little startups, are doing a good job of getting new breakthrough medicines. With respect to the human cost, let's put it in perspective. I don't mean to lower the significance of anyone who's suffering from any particular disease, but keep in mind that 90% of the prescriptions in the U.S. are generic drugs. 90%. Okay, so there's no IP issue at all with respect to that. 90% of the drugs on the WHO essential drug list are generic drugs. No issue. So what we're talking about are the newest drugs that are coming out of the pipeline. Okay, and what I'm concerned about then is not just where we stand now, but where the future of the industry is going. Because if you look at those pipelines, what's being done now are things like gene therapy and cell therapy, okay, where you take your blood and you give it to a company and they modify your DNA to correct for a mutation, and they give it back to you, which looks more like a service actually than a drug. And what's the IP on that? I mean, an Indian company is not going to be able to do that in a warehouse. Probably the only company that can do that, at least for a while, and given all the billions they're spending in it, is that company. I don't think we're having the right debate, because I don't think we're keeping up with where people in Cambridge are doing. This is what they're doing right now. We're not talking about even sibosbuvir, which is a chemical drug. There are going to be examples like that, but that's not where the technology is going. We need to be talking about where the technology is going. One final point on sibosbuvir in China. Of course, China can afford it. They just don't want to pay. They don't want to negotiate with Gilead. And every single patient in China can get that drug if they want it. China has $3 trillion in foreign. They would rather spend if they want to spend it on tanks, if they want to spend it on other things. It's a political issue within China, and it's unfair to ask the industry to bear that burden because the Chinese government doesn't want to pay for that drug, and because they want to give it to a Chinese company to produce. I don't think that's fair.
I want to open up to the audience in a second.
Hang on a second, Neil. Let's take that one step further. Let's go look at the case of a smaller country, Colombia, that took steps to try to issue a compulsory license on Gleevec. They ultimately decided.
What did you say? Which country?
Colombia.
Colombia, yeah.
Colombia, yeah. Ultimately, after a lot of internal dialogue, made a decision not to do that. They went the pricing route instead, and put price controls on that the company had no choice whether to take or leave. In Colombia, according to their department, their health ministry, there are 15,000 patients who were in need of Gleevec. There are several generics available on the market. In fact, there's even a couple different varieties of Gleevec that were available. But they went after one particular variety that was going to cost $1,000 per patient per year. So 15,000 patients, $15 million. Is that a fiscal burden on Colombia? Absolutely. Does it break the bank? No, just to Joe's point so this is a political choice that originated in Geneva and was pushed on Colombia just as it's being pushed on Malaysia and other countries in an attempt to set a precedent to override intellectual property rights on a global basis, to make it so routine that so-called TRIPS flexibilities are used at will. The outcome of such a victory, if you want to call it that, would be entirely Pyrrhic, because it would have a tremendously detrimental impact on the production of new innovative medicines. And I think it's important that we go back to, you asked about more IP or less. Wrong question, absolutely. It's about the reliability of intellectual property, not as an incentive, not as a reward. Business doesn't ask for incentives and rewards. Business is looking for an opportunity to compete on a clear understanding of the rules of the road. A patent system provides a clear set of rules. It says to the company, if you do this, you will have these rights for, in this instance, a certain period of time. 20 years minus the time it takes to get regulatory market approval following clinical trials, so some 20 minus X. In that time, they have to be able to feed back into the pipeline enough money to keep that business going, to pay for those 90% of medicines in clinical trials that failed to make it to market as a successful drug. And so what we hear far too often is, well, it only costs $2 to manufacture a pill. Well, okay, that's the cost of providing a dose of generic medicine. But the price that countries, usually health ministries, in our case, insurance companies or patients in the United States pay for a medicine, an innovative medicine, is the cost of innovation. Now, you can have a debate about whether society should bear that cost, whether the innovative company should bear that cost, or whether the consumer should bear that cost, and that's a perfectly, rational debate to have. But to ignore it and to say the company has no justification for charging its price is simply willful ignorance.
So let's go deeper into both cost of innovation, and let's definitely consider Joe's points about the changing technologies of treatment. The changing technologies that are no longer the production of molecules, but are, as you put it, services. But before we go there, let's finish the question that I'm trying to push us into, which is not more or less IP. I'll abandon that one. That was Matt's question. It's gone. Sorry, Matt. But
the answer was yes. Right,
but the question is,
right.
What limitations, if any, on IP, what clever strategies to make drugs more accessible are you or are you not prepared to support under any circumstances? So I want to push you, compulsory licensing. Never ever a good thing for a government? Is it always because they want to buy more tanks and they don't want to spend their money? No, I'm repeating the argument you made.
Yeah, right.
Is it always for that reason? Or could it ever be compulsory licensing because we want to expand our health service, we want to get the meds to people, we can't afford the prices, we can't pay for all of the costs of innovation that may have taken place in the United States over many years, some of which may have been in the public sector. We got to do compulsory licensing. There are examples of other countries, Thailand and others. I don't know if you guys want to come in.
Well, I mean, I just want to say a couple of things, and forgive me for jumping in. First, we have to make a distinction between the US market and the global market. I think it's one thing to say that a patent has been issued by the USPTO and is good in the United States, and so no US company can compete until that patent is expired. I think it's a completely different proposition to have an international patent system that blocks that competition worldwide. So the one thing, Jerry Reichman is here, Fred Abbott is, I mean, you've got people that are way more expert in this than I am, but you really do want to start asking the question, what about antitrust laws, competition laws? Why don't we have a robust deployment of antitrust law globally on this question of pricing? Right? If everyone's happy with the patent system, with the issuance of the monopoly, and the question is just, well, we think prices are too high, well, the answer for that is competition.
Yeah.
Right? And you can get competition in any number of ways, but certainly that, I think, is a robust answer, and I think Fred's written quite a bit about that. Jerry's talked a lot about that. Those are rules that already exist. We see it in TRIPS, but there's clearly a vacuum in that sort of, in the reliance on that and the use of that, and that's a government failure. I mean, these are governments around the world. Let me just say one more thing. The second thing that I think is really important in this regard, and I want to really put it back to this question with the industry, is developing countries in particular do not have the bargaining power of the US government. So when they're sitting across from a Gilead or from an Eli Lilly or whoever, it's not the same. And so I would plead that there be some reflection on, well, how do you even out that disparity of power? Because to the extent that you're saying China can afford it or Colombia, it's always a political choice. There is not a single country for whom it's not a political choice. But they are choosing between health, between education, between terrorism, between security, all kinds of things. Every government is making this choice. And I agree with you that this is not something that industry bears alone. But in the absence of a competitive market and finite resources and people dying, choices have to be made. And my view is that when it comes to medicines, particularly life-saving medicines, you cannot put a price on a human life.
So national emergency measures, compulsory licensing, you may or may not say that it has to be an emergency, global regulation of pricing. So we've got two instruments that could, that would control, potentially reduce the profitability of some drugs with access and morality and people's lives in mind. Take your choice, gentlemen. Which one would you prefer?
A couple things. Let me just say this. We hear there's some highly publicized cases that we've talked about today. Sabosvir in China, or a couple of other countries, Gleevec in a couple of countries. What you need to think about is that one thing to keep in mind: companies are negotiating with governments every day on pricing, and products are getting into these countries, and mutually beneficial agreements are being
Let me jump in. I want to ask you one question. Is it true, because my reading of the South Africa situation is that the negotiation that took place over 10 to 15 years from about 1996, when South Africa changed the law and theoretically made it possible in the future there would be parallel importing of generic drugs, that's what precipitated suddenly a reduce in the pricing. So the negotiations all got much easier once a government measure was at least threatened, if not, actually taken. So when you say, there's negotiations taking place, do you think it's fair that governments should use a stick in those negotiations, such as the ones that have been...
this is the thing.
I'd like to react. I'd like to react to that. It's a little weird what we're discussing now, because the system is the government is granting exclusive monopoly rights to somebody, for a fair amount of time, 20 years, and there is a lot of ways to extend it. Well, that's 20 years, and it's extended.
From discovery, not from...
The same government has the right, and it's in the same law, to lift that, monopoly situation if the government decides that it's a necessity for so many different reasons. It's totally free to do that, and it can be so many different reasons. And it's just normal, it's just a way to try to balance a situation and to balance the interests. The problem we have today is that we're talking the way you do as if, doing a compulsory license was the weirdest thing ever, like a dramatic action. It's part of the system. The system is supposed to be balanced, The problem we have is that patent system that we have today is not anymore what it was supposed to do, and it's not achieving what it was supposed to achieve. We're far away from any kind of balance. Governments are in position, they negotiate. Come on, we're having discussion in Europe a lot now about the sort of negotiation that they are having. They're in a situation where there is a social pressure to have access to products, and there is a monopoly. And they don't want to use the tools to lift the monopoly. What kind of negotiation is that? It's not negotiation. Prices are skyrocketing, and it's insane. You talk about the 2 cents to produce. When we see the situation with the Sabosvir, we, MSF, pay €75 for a 3-month cure because there is competition amongst generic producers. On the other hand, in rich market, we're still paying dozens of thousands of euros for the same 3-month treatment. Do you think that difference in price makes sense? Does it make sense? No, the only sense it makes is that Gilead was happy to do 55% of profit in 1 year. Now they're back to 15%, and it's a dramatic situation for Gilead, I'm ready to cry. You know, it's so dramatic for them. I mean, that's what we hear every day. You know?
I know that's what you hear. If I could just point out a couple of things in response. One is,
and then I will also respond. I would ready to agree with you on the reliability aspect of the patent system. That's a big problem we have today. Because you say people need to be able to rely on it. Indeed, I mean, I think that for a lot of business, small, medium business, they need to rely on the patent system. That means they need to know that, you know, there are quality patents, and it's not just, you know, an increasing number of patents going in every direction where we don't know, you know, most of those patents are bogus patents. They are not, you know, they are very weak patents. But to be sure of that, you need to challenge them. You need to, you know, spend time, spend energy, get lawyers to look at them so that you know whether as a business you can function in that environment. So that system, I mean, it's really dysfunctional even for business, except if you are a very big business, then you have, you know, the capacity to manage that terrible mess.
So a couple of things I just like to, I mean, look, it's easy to get anecdotal, and I could do that too. I would point out that most drugs, that if you look at the UN data in terms of what countries are spending on medicines, it's a constant number over the last 30 or 40 years of about 10 to 15% on average of healthcare costs. Prices of medicines are not in general going up. There's always a few expensive drugs, and then there's always drugs going off patent that have gotten cheaper.
That's why social security systems, you know, in Europe.
Now let's talk about Europe. Oh, Europe.
Yeah.
Europe is allowed. What Europe does is control prices. They don't need an IP. They don't need to use the IP system to do that. In Europe, you take the price the government tells you to take, or you get zero sales. You know what companies do? It is what they do. Okay. And countries will lower the price down to as close as they can get to the marginal cost of production. And who has leverage? You know, France is a single payer. Germany has a single payer. The UK has a single payer. They set the price. We don't set the price in Europe.
So I guess my question is your complaint that the price is not high enough, or that the profits are too low? I mean, I'm trying to get a sense of what's going on here.
I'm not complaining about anything. I'm just saying that
it's the most profitable industry, you know, above every other industry. So that's where it's a bit
funny. We began with a question from Ben, and I just want to keep us focused on this because I think, you know, we want to hear each other. I'm assuming we all agree that we need to ensure that there is as much access for human life as possible to medicines. Many governments cannot afford the prices for a lot of medicines. Mm-hmm. And that is true across the spectrum.
I'll stipulate that.
Okay, good. So the question, I guess, is how much is enough? That's the question that is relevant to this issue of the business model. Because it's one thing to say you're making millions of dollars over and above your marginal cost. It's another thing to say you're making billions. So I guess the question is, for the reliability, for the profitability of your investors, at what point do you think, given that it's a monopoly, what's enough?
Well, let's say a couple of things. How do you answer that question generically? I mean, what's enough in any particular case?
5%?
In the case, a return, 5% of return. Okay, well, let's look at it this way then. As I said, we have to keep in mind that for every project that succeeds, 10 fail.
Many fail.
Okay, so that's just the fact, the way it is. Mm-hmm. So the question from our perspective is, how do you keep the engine of innovation going, people investing this? If there was a 5% return on every medicine that came out of the pipeline, would there be money going into the front of the pipeline? I doubt it.
Well, when you have that
I don't know what the number is. I don't know what the number is.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just saying that the successes have to finance the failures for the whole system.
Let's take a second.
So you can't look at one drug and just what went into producing that. That's sort of ex post argument. That drug was successful in the end. If you knew that drug was going to be the one of the 100 that was going to be successful, and you should have only invested in that drug and forgotten the others, but you don't beforehand. Mm-hmm. So what return to that $150 billion that's going into the system every year to invest in the 7,000 clinical projects on different drugs that are in the system right now? We don't know which ones are going to succeed. How much return is needed on the ones that do succeed in order to keep that system going? I'm not exactly sure.
I suppose one has to ask whether you're convinced, Joe, that the money that it's made is going back into the start of the pipeline. Is that what it's doing? Is the money that's made when a drug is extremely successful, are we convinced that is directed back into
Well, it doesn't work that way.
It could be going to the MGM. You're right.
No, 70. Look, of all the new drugs that have been launched in the last 10 years, 70% of them originated with small companies, not with Pfizer, or Merck or whatever. They buy the drugs at the end of the pipeline, and they market them globally. So it's not a question of where they put their money. The question is who is investing in the 3,000 or 4,000 companies up front and taking that risk, and what kind of return is necessary for that process, that pipeline, to keep moving, because we all depend on that. Remember, there are a lot of patients who don't get treated for diseases and die because there's no cure for a disease.
Let's check.
We have to keep that part of it going.
I want to short circuit this a little bit.
Ben. Hold on. Because this is getting silly. What does intellectual property do? Does it reward an innovator? Does it reward a company that brings a new drug to market? No. When you think about IP as a reward, what happens? You have innovation, which we take for granted. You add IP, and it equals a cost. That's actually an inaccurate way. To Joe's point, in terms of creating a sustainable innovation ecosystem, the way it works is you have a system. It doesn't depend on any one patent. To Ruth's point, to Dr. Krikorian's point, individual patents can be invalidated. They can be compulsory licensed. Happens every day all around the world. Patents are invalidated for myriad of reasons. But when IP works and where it works, it's because there is a system that innovators rely on enough that they see a pathway to commercialization. And so oftentimes there's a small investment in basic research. Maybe it's public funding. Right now in the United States, that's at 44%, an all-time low. 67 to 72% of the funding that goes into research and development. This is the applied science part of it, where you take a basic discovery, turn it into a usable product. That's dominated by private sector spending. And what happens then is there are multiple transactions that have to take place in the transfer from publicly funded research to university research to startup to, maybe that startup gets bought by a Gilead. Nothing wrong with that. They're still paying for the investment. You're having to internally pay for marketing. You're having to convince your C-suite executives to invest in this drug instead of that drug. So at each stage there's an exchange of value that has to take place, and the value depends on a reliable patent. So in this sort of form of the innovation equation, what happens is that the IP comes first. Well before a patent is granted, it's the system that comes first. You add in private sector investment, and the output is the innovative product.
So maybe we should be reflecting, and I want to invite one or two people in the audience to speak. I don't know where exactly they are. Okay, great. I know we've got a few people I can name, but if there are people who are very keen to come in, put your hands up, and we'll bring a mic to you. You said we need a sustainable ecosystem for innovation. And one question, I think, then, which IP helps to maintain, one question we could ask, if the thing is working to some extent, but not working to ensure that every life is protected, every life is valued, every person that could have access to medicines has access, is there another ecosystem that could work alongside the current one? If the current ecosystem means that there has to be a lot of profit at one end, to make it attractive for people to take the risk, because otherwise they'll presumably go invest in something else other than meds. Is there some other way to get resources into research and development in medicines other than the ecosystem that you're talking about? I don't know if that's something, I know we've got one or two people who have something to say about that, Suri and others. Are there other ways to get resources in, and are there questions that people want to ask on the basis of what they've heard so far? Please introduce yourself. I don't know who everybody is.
My name is Suri Moon. I lead research at the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of Geneva and have been studying innovation and access to medicines for about 20 years. One of the questions I'd like to put on the table is, what is the willingness of some of the small and medium enterprises that have been mentioned, who are perhaps a little bit less stuck in the current system, to actually entertain some alternate business models of R&D? And I think over the last 5 years in particular, almost every extended debate on this issue of innovation and access and IP comes down to, we have to change the current R&D business model because the way it's currently working is not sustainable for society. And I've seen very few business leaders of the larger firms being willing, at least publicly, to talk about new business models to entertain them. But when we look at small and medium enterprises, they actually are engaging all the time with public-private product development partnerships, with the US government's BARDA program, for example. That most of those projects seem to be relying on innovation coming from SMEs. And so it's quite interesting. I think both of you were saying that's where the innovation is coming from. Those are the companies that are in bio.
What's that business model? Can you give us a tiny bit of insight in a few sentences? If it's not the one that they've talked about, it's a partnership between those companies?
In a nutshell, the idea would be that you can have public investment as a push mechanism, lowering the cost and lowering the risk of R&D, and you can also have public rewards at the end of the process that can act as a pull mechanism that can reward the R&D, but not necessarily rely on, so the company would not have to rely on a high price to recoup its R&D. It could get a lump sum payment, for example, and then a medicine could be made available at a low generic price immediately in exchange for a prize.
So let's park that question. Somebody wanted to talk about India. Is that yeah?
I'm from India, but not representing India. I'm Gopakumar.
Okay.
I work with.
I got a message to say.
I work with Third World Network. What I understood correctly from the intervention of Bio as well as US Chamber of Commerce is saying that it is important to recover the R&D cost, and once that recovery takes place, you don't mind it to be in generics and spread manufactured in as many as places, right? Is that the correct understanding? Yeah, if so, then I think this creates the data does not support actually. If you look at the global pharmaceutical market, around 74% of the market concentrated in Europe and North America. So only 24%, that including Australia, coming around 24%, okay? So that means the recovery of the R&D cost is by and large is taking place from these two markets. So that means 90% of the people lives in other countries are asked to wait till the recovery takes place. That means the people are held at ransom till you maintain the price in the, and recover the cost. So that in a way, is resulting in gross human rights violations, and even in the case of HIV/AIDS, even you can be charged for genocide, right? Because so many people died after, and it was denied. The medicine was available, but it was denied. Why? Because to recovery of the cost. And where the recovery took place? From these two continents, not where the people were suffering. Okay, so this is a problem. And I'll also give you two more data and stop it. So India is supposed to be the pharmaceutical, pharmacy of the poor countries. And the entire pharmaceutical value of India's pharmaceutical industry is around 20 billion. So if you take the two top-selling brands currently in 2017, the turnover of these two brands, Humira and the other one, I forget the name, it's Sofosbuvir and another combination, it is 27 billion. So these two brands overtake the value of the entire India's pharmaceutical industry. And in India, where the medicine is available cheaper, 40 million people are pushed below the poverty line because they could pay. They were paid to, they were forced to pay for the medicine. So in this situation, is it a good idea to give up that portion of the profit, or you are not making any profit from those countries, okay? To allow them to make use of the progress of science and technology. That's a human rights guaranteed under the Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Are you violating these rights in a way?
So one more voice, and then I think there's a voice up there, lady up there. We'll come back to you.
Hi, my name is Padmashri Sampath. I'm a Berkman Klein Fellow at Harvard University, and I've worked at the UN before for a long time, and I have about 2 decades of experience working on IP and innovation issues. And I have just 2 questions to ask to the panel. I mean, if the entire objective of the patent system is to promote innovation, then if you have a global patent system, it should promote global innovation. And that is not what the current patent system is doing. It is actually promoting innovation, but not in a global sense and in a global context. And I speak from the perspective of a person who's studying innovation from the South for a very long time. And I want to put forward just 2 things. I can speak to a million of issues in this context, but I'll just put forward 2 things. One is, I'm not really convinced that the way that the technological trajectory of just the pharmaceutical innovation and the health sector is going right now is the right technological trajectory to go, because it's not the government and it's not a different entity which is looking at global innovation as such, which is deciding the direction of technological innovation, is the firms. It's the firms that are leading the innovation, that are at the forefront, that have the patents, that have the market power, that are deciding where we go next. Now, is this the way we want to do business? Is this the way we want to decide the fate of millions, billions of people who are not able to decide their own fates? That's the first question I want to place to the panel. A second question I want to place to the panel is a question that I've actually struggled with as an economist. You see, historically, the whole purpose of innovation and patents is that you grant an incentive, and the firms that do well with this incentive and make profits reinvest the profits into the economy, and through that you see benefits to the local industry. And there is very little evidence of this happening right now, because what is happening is that you have firms, and these are based globally, they could be based anywhere, and they're investing in R&D, and they are having profits. These profits are not benchmarked. We don't know if the patent that covers it, the amount of R&D that went into inventing this medicine, this drug, this product, is justifying the global benefits that come from these sales. So that money is going into R&D, into different things. It's not going into the economies that are buying for it. And China is really an exception. I don't want to discuss China. China can buy out the US the next day because of its foreign reserves. I want to discuss the kind of developing countries that we really need to be talking about. So this is what I want to pose to the panel.
So you've kind of got 3 pleas for a global thought process, which is none of them were about more or less IP. They were all about a different kind of ecosystem. One was a different business model, firms having a different business model where incentives are provided by public money, potentially, at the beginning and the end. Second plea was about timing, if I'm not mistaken. Why should the developing world wait until money's been made and okay, now we'll think about bringing the drugs to you once we've recouped our costs? And the third, well, there are a couple there, but one was certainly about, are we going the right way technologically? You talked about where the technology is going. Is the ecosystem taking the technology where the world needs it to go?
Can I take a crack? Or I don't want to dominate, sure. But I have thoughts on all those questions. I don't see where to start on this. I think that with respect to where the technology is going, let me start with that one. What we have now are, well, let me start with the globalization of innovation, because I think that this is something I'd like to kind of put to rest. People should come to the convention that Bio has every year. I'll make a shameless plug for that. And the reason is it was held in Boston last year. It'll be in Philadelphia next year. We had 18,000 people come to that convention. 40% of them were from outside the US. Okay, that would have not been the case 10 years ago. And the 75 countries came. India had a huge pavilion. South Africa had a pavilion. I went to a conference in South Africa 4 weeks ago. 800 people came. These are South Africans who are starting to put money into biotech innovation. The world is changing in front of us. I've heard that these arguments are getting very stale. Okay, innovation is becoming globalized. And you know the reason? Is because you can do a startup now with the technology, with things like gene editing, CRISPR. It's very inexpensive to use. You don't need to have a $7 billion R&D program the way Pfizer used to. You can be a startup company and you become part of the innovation system. This is why most of the major economies in the world, including in the developing world, have a plan to develop their biotech sector. Maybe first in the agriculture part, and then an environmental part, eventually in the drugs part. I don't think it's true that innovation is not becoming more globalized. It's becoming more globalized by the day, and I give you dozens and dozens of examples. That's the business model. This is becoming a global ecosystem. It's not a US ecosystem anymore.
But you don't want the public sector getting much more involved in trying to help determine
Well, this is the other
priorities.
question. How do we pick? Okay, 90% of the projects fail. Right now what we have is, as I said, 4,000 US companies, probably another 4,000 outside of the US. Now, what's happening now, and it's not the companies that are doing the investing. This is the thing. We talk about this as if it's the company that's making the investment. It's the company that's making the profit. It's investors. It's venture capitalists who are making the investments in companies. All right, and what they're doing is you have companies that are basically, and these are just people, these are scientists, these are doctors, these are people, and they're extremely idealistic people, by the way. They're getting into business because they have a great idea, and they want to come up with a cure or a treatment that doesn't exist now. All right, they're not, I know we have this sort of picture, you seem to have, many people here seem to have this picture of this sort of greedy, big skyscraper somewhere. That's not how this innovation gets started. And it's not how it gets financed. What we have now are venture capitalists from all over the world, including China now, including their funds from the Middle East and Asia and Europe and even Africa, making bets on which of ones are going to succeed. We don't know in advance. Now, we could set up, maybe governments could say, yeah, well, we'll try to pick some. But the statistics are they're going to fail 90% of the time. And so my question is, maybe, or my suggestion would be, instead of governments spending hundreds of billions of dollars digging a lot of dry holes, which is what it would involve, maybe it would be better off if they spent that money on successful medicines after they're developed, and let the private sector take the risk. Buying them. I mean, why take all the risk and fail? 90% of those projects are going to fail. Right now, a lot of venture capitalists are losing a lot of money, believe me,
right.
On that.
Think a little bit about the other two proposals, but I don't want to ask you to address all three one by one.
And I'm sorry,
and
I'll
I want to
back.
come to, I want to come to, I don't know, Ruth, if you want to speak on this.
Patrick hasn't spoken much, and
That's
I think
right.
we should let him talk a bit.
Well, I do want
Forgive
to.
me.
I actually want to challenge Gail or Ruth to say that there are alternative You've pointed out some weaknesses of the system that is currently in operation. It's a complicated ecosystem. We've had some proposals on how to make sure that this ecosystem changes in a way to accommodate people. Are we in danger of being unrealistic or even, dare I say, utopian in our proposals to change this ecosystem? It's generating drugs. I mean, it's generating cancer treatments that work. It's generating gene therapies that might do amazing things in the future. So are you prepared to accept that although you're very unhappy with this ecosystem, that we should be careful about shaking it to the point where those investors walk away, go do something else, I don't know what they're going to do, go and invest in something else, and therefore we don't get some of the benefits out of it that we currently get?
You know, I just think that the argument that we may fail for trying to be better is an argument for us to stay as bad as we are. I think that's the wrong policy position to begin from. We can do better, and there are lots of areas of low-hanging fruit to tweak the system. We don't have to change it overnight, but we do need to begin to make some steps towards making it effective and making it one in which the price does not, in fact, literally kill people. And we do need to begin to think about the direction of innovation. I think Padma's point is a really important one. And that's frankly, I think, to the benefit of the private sector as well. That the burden of leading the direction of R&D should not really be the private sector's. I do also think that there are other ways and other models that promote clarity, reliability, and that may have lesser costs. I mean, part of the challenge is we're using a very big club to try to address a variety of problems that don't all manifest in the same way. And so the market for cancer drugs, market for TB, malaria, dysentery, diarrhea, these are different markets. And so part of it, and this is a challenge with the IP system in general, right? That we have this one-size-fits-all patent system. Forget design patents, which are creating havoc. Jerry is smiling over there. He's, creating havoc in ways that the utility patent system has already done. But there clearly is a problem. The other thing that I think is troubling to me is that certainly where medicines are concerned, the intimate relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the government is something that needs to be examined, right? Changing that relationship in ways that I think may be painful for both parties, but ultimately better for the public interest. The pharmaceutical industry is extremely powerful. Government has perhaps unwisely over the years relied on the industry too much for the production of drugs and for the business model that we have now. That has to change. It's going to take courageous policymakers to think about how to change that. I believe in the private industry. I believe in the work that many scientists are doing. But I'm a teacher. And I think that when we are involved in an industry whose fundamental mission is to enhance the quality of human life, that our value system, even though we're generating income, needs to be different. And I think that's a task that the industry has to take on. I think the biotech industry is also a very different industry. And Joe's point about this not becoming a property right and becoming a services model is one that's extremely important. Because when you're not attacking a patent, what are you going to say about the service that costs $1 million to save your life? I mean, the fundamental structure is the same, it's just not a property right. And we all need to begin to think about what does this new frontier of innovation spell for global public health, right?
And if I could just agree with you, I mean, I do want to find some common ground, lest people think there is none. I mean, I don't think the private sector can research everything that needs to be researched. I totally agree there's neglected diseases that don't get researched adequately in the developed world. I do think that public funding for those and maybe some other model, but I would just caution that the amount of resources that you would need to put in that might be multiples greater than you think they are, given the risk. Okay, and societies need to do that. Yeah. I think I would also say, and we haven't really gotten to this, is this the concept, which I have a difficult defining this, but I think it's something implicitly we maybe all support to some extent, is that ability to pay is a factor in all of this. In other words, the price in the U.S. is different than the price in a middle-income country, or should be, is different than the price in a least developed country.
Occasionally, it's more in the least developed countries, unfortunately, but
than in the U.S.
Yeah,
I'd like to see the examples.
Occasionally, it is more.
It is.
I mean,
it's not generally.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap up because I think Gail needs to jump in as well, and Patrick, and I just want to wrap up with this one point. The system is flawed. I mean, I think we all agree. We may disagree on where it's flawed.
I don't agree. I would check the premise.
I just ask you, flawed at what?
So let me just say this.
It's good at producing new medicines.
Yeah, let me just say this. Once you agree to grant a 20-year monopoly without knowing whether or not that, I mean, by your
It's not
argument.
20 years from when it enters the market. You know that, right? It's 10.
Yes, but let's just say,
that was made for.
call it 15, call it 10. My
Okay.
point is just that it's a monopoly. Once you do that,
To some extent.
then what you are doing, we've created a monster that we cannot tame. We are addicted to the profits of this business model. We are addicted to it. And that means we need some form of rehab, detox, something. But we're addicted to it. And I'm sorry.
Is
You
it-
know, my
Sorry,
father
sorry.
said to me, don't be a teacher, be a big-time lawyer so you can make some money. I chose to be a teacher, right? And when we choose to operate and to work in certain fields and in certain industries, they come with responsibilities. And my point is that the pharmaceutical industry has a responsibility. It has been privileged, it has brought much to the table, but it has a responsibility, and governments need to begin, just like the industry itself, to begin to look at the ways in which the pricing models, the competitive environment, the underlying policies, the subsidies, what ways does this public-private trade-off enhance the global public good? Because right now it's not doing that. And for as long as it doesn't, the industry is going to face these questions about its legitimacy and about how much is enough. How many lives have to pay in order for this profit to be worthwhile?
Can I ask I mean, I mean, I'll take the example of. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, you know, how we measure the success of the imperfect world that we live in versus another world. We could take away the profits or reduce them dramatically. We don't know what effect that's going to have. If we're going to have the same number of medicines coming out, I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't have the same number of medicines come out. But if people think that we do, I'd like to see what the reasoning is behind that. Secondly, with respect to people losing their lives, I mean, we do have a cure for hepatitis C now. Now, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we did not. And in a few years, that drug will be off patent and everywhere. And there will be full competition. Already, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There is a, you know, you say that the sofosbuvir is a monopoly. Yes, it's a monopoly on sofosbuvir. But AbbVie also has a product now that was developed less than a year later that also is a cure for hepatitis C. So if nobody had those drugs, then you couldn't accuse anybody of profiteering on them. But then humanity would not have a cure for hepatitis C either. And how many lives would have been lost in the counterfactual? Yeah. But you'll never know if the drug isn't developed.
But it's a very wrong way to put things, because the question is not would we not have the product, it's at what price do we have the product.
Yes.
That's the problem we have now. We are paying multiple times the same thing. So, and you know, one example, Ebola. So big outbreak in 2014. There was a candidate product sitting on the shelf, not developed, no interest from the company. Mm-hmm. We still do not have the product.
Yes.
You know.
Well, why aren't governments stepping up then?
So you're asking how do you want to assess whether it's satisfying or not? Well, it's not. You know, it's not. The fact that we have people with Hep C or cancer in the UK who are buying drug online from India, clear sign that it's not satisfying. We have a serious problem. So as long as we're having this conversation and you want to pretend that it's okay, it's gonna be really hard to work, I think. This said, I think there are tons of entry points to try to improve the system, and it's always weird when we discuss this as if it was, we have a system, let's get another system, like totally different. No, it's not going to happen like that, I totally agree. Well, we can work on so many different aspects. We can work on, so we pay many times. Putting money to develop, to do the development, more resources for development, more resources to cover the risk. Public money cover a lot of the risk, but to cover more of the risk, why not? If we don't pay, if we don't pay 150,000 euro for 1 year of cancer treatment, then, let's use that money to actually develop products. I totally agree with that. The transparency aspect, it's a huge topic. Around pharmaceutical company, you say, there is the problem of the relationship between policymakers and the industry. And when we say the industry, is I think we have also to be clear, we talk about the big industry. We talk about a handful of multinationals. And that's also the problem when we talk about pharmaceutical research. We always talk about those guys. I think it's worth really seeing that indeed the industry is not just that. There are many different players, and we can work differently with different people. And that's where, policymakers are to get out of their, loop and start to think, how are they going to work with the other guys, and what are the conditionalities for the collaboration, And that's where, it's a serious question. What is the public return for the public investments? And we can construct relationships, and we can talk with many researchers who are happy to do research, in different ways. But, and that's being here, it may be a little difficult, but I think to me it's a bit of a problem when we start the conversation about IP is first. First, it's not true, IP is not first. First is a lot of investments from many different sources, that it's not IP. And also, if we want to have proper medical research, IP may be an aspect, but it's just a tool among other tools. The problem we have is that now we always discuss as if it was the only way to do things. When in reality, what happened is that the industry is piling up incentives of so many different forms, whether it's tax cuts, IP, reimbursement of medicine, in-kind, support for, hospitals, for clinical trials. I mean, so many different things, So
if there's a different model or
unpack
system,
all that and discuss each incentive, in which condition do we use them and grant them.
if there's a different model or system, let's do it.
Yeah.
I have to ask, hang on. I have to ask, what's stopping you? If the public sector can develop new medicines and bring them to market, by all means, do it.
Without IP.
If
Go ahead.
patents and IP don't need to be involved, okay.
No, but
if you
and
want
by the way,
the private
you'll put our
sector,
industry out of business.
if you
But
want
that's
the
fair.
private sector
Fair
to
enough.
continue to invest in innovation and continue to bring new innovative products to market, then there has to be a pathway to a business model. There has to be an opportunity at the end of the path to take ownership of a product, offer it at a price, and gain a return. That is the only way that money is allocated to risk-taking in an innovative biopharmaceutical space. And money is fungible. If there is no opportunity for profit in the pharmaceutical business, that investment will go somewhere else. It'll go to ICT, it'll go to energy, but it will not go to biopharmaceuticals.
Patrick,
So you have to make a real choice here. What we hear is the demonization of business, that the private sector shouldn't be able to make a profit in the biopharmaceutical sector, and that if a drug isn't instantly available to everyone in the world, then it would be better not to do it at all, because that is the outcome of the models that you're suggesting.
Now, Patrick, I've got to jump in and say to you, I don't think that you are saying don't try to improve the system because the investors will run away and you won't have any medicines. I don't think you're saying that. We're trying to come up with proposals on how the system might be improved, how the ecosystem, this complicated ecosystem, might be improved, and how we might address the issue that Gail and in particular Ruth raised right at the beginning, which is that not all the outcomes are moral. Not all the outcomes are valuing human life.
The premise, Ben, that you have suggested, that Ruth, if you'll forgive me for putting words in your mouth, and Dr. Krikorian have suggested, is that prices are high because of big business. Check your premise. Prices are high because it costs a lot of money to research, to commercialize, to develop, to test, and to bring a new product to market. And if you try to divorce the ends from the means, you will not have the ends.
So let me just object that that's actually not my premise. That is not my premise.
It sure sounds like it.
That is not my premise. And I also think you've mischaracterized a number of the points. Because the issue is, number one, far deeper, more nuanced, and more serious than you are suggesting. It's not as simple as we give you the patent, you make the money, and all the drugs that we need come out. To Joe's point, we don't have enough drugs today for a lot of diseases. The patent system has not addressed that. And you live in a world in which you have...
Science doesn't address it
Hold
either.
on, hold on.
But this is my point, right? To go back to something Gail said earlier, this is fundamentally about policy. It's not about innovation alone. It is not about pricing alone. It is about policy.
It's about policy that enables or
Give me a second.
hinders innovation. Wait, you
Let me,
can't just let all these go, Joe.
You can't throw innovation like a Band-Aid and just say because it's innovation, it's good. That's not it. There's a lot of innovation that occurs without the patent system, outside of the patent system, within the patent system, and despite the patent system. So you can't just say innovation. There are lots of economists in the room and they'll tell you that. That's not the point. I appreciate your point about rewarding the private sector and about certainty and stability of legal rules. I don't think anyone contests that.
Rewarding the
But
private sector was
here
your point,
is-
not ours, remember?
Okay, profit. Call it profit. Profit is your point? Okay, profiting the private sector. The question is this: we have policies that are in tension with that. And those policies have to do with the value of human life. They have to do with the return to the public for the public's investment. They have to do with an industry that is supposed to be dedicated to improving human welfare. It has to do with the global burden of disease. It has to do with the way we structure this business model around which Big Pharma operates. Those are the questions. And I think for you to say that it's just about making sure they have the patents so that you can spit out these drugs is completely simplistic. And it avoids the big problems that are on the table. There are problems on the table. If you would be satisfied, for example, in a world in which you had patents, but everyone could take a license, would that be okay? No. This is what you've said. So we have to look at the low-hanging fruit and then begin to tackle the hard questions. Why are the prices so high? Why are they sometimes higher in developing countries than here? What about the system in the United States itself, where we are facing a health crisis and a pricing crisis? This is not just limited anymore to the north and to the south.
Well,
and so what we are saying is that this system is not delivering what it could, and it is certainly not delivering what it should. And we ought to pay attention to that.
Now,
Just
before you come back in,
the moderator have a word.
we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want us to do unless that the House says we should stay longer, and I want us to try and do at least one thing in that 20 minutes, which is I want to put you 10. Only 10.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. In the remaining 10 minutes, I want to do at least one thing, which we started off with and has been repeated a couple of times. There's an ecosystem there. There's a system there. It's definitely not, you've conceded this, Joe, I think, Patrick, you'll tell us if you have or not, that there's an immorality of outcome. There's an imperfection of outcome at least, and I think Ruth has stated it more strongly than that as an immorality of outcome. People are not getting access to treatment and medicines that they could potentially have and that we would like them to have. Hold on. Which interventions are you prepared to accept? Which discussions would you encourage us to have about improving the system? We've suggested a few. A few have been suggested. One was on price. Should we have a very, deep conversation about price and profit? Should we have a conversation about compulsory licensing and spreading the ability to produce? I want to give one small case study of a debate that I read took place in the United States just a couple of years ago about compulsory licensing of Cipro when there was a debate about the possibility of an anthrax attack. Would you be opposed to that? Would you be against compulsory licensing under those circumstances? I didn't get a chance to push you on whether you're ever sympathetic and keen on the idea of compulsory licensing. Are there emergencies in existence? Are there circumstances? Is there an immorality in existence in the world where there should be regular, and Gail pointed out my mistake of referring to compulsory licensing only as an exception, as an emergency. Should there be routine compulsory licensing because that helps us to ensure that drugs reach people under extreme circumstances.
I'll make a couple of reports. I mean, first of all, with respect to the immorality of outcomes, let's just keep in mind that there's blame enough to go around. Is it immoral that India spends 2% of its GDP on healthcare and spends 12% on defense against, I guess, an attack from Pakistan? Is that immoral? Because then they can't afford healthcare for their people? I don't know. I mean, because if we're going to talk about genocide and people dying, and we use those kinds of terms, then let's talk about all of the actors and what they're doing. This industry is pretty good at producing products, okay, of producing innovations. Maybe not all of them are great, maybe not all of them are perfect, but we are coming up with cures for diseases. With respect to, okay, are there any conditions under which a compulsory license is appropriate? Yes, I mean, the world trading rules say in a case of a public health emergency. Let me just tell you, in a case, maybe an anthrax or maybe a pandemic or an epidemic where the supplier of the drug does not have the capacity to service the people suffering from a very fast, raging epidemic, of course, you might want to have to license that drug out to others to make sure that the supply is adequate to meet the public health needs. There was however, and I think there's a limit on the other side too. We were speaking of India again, there was of all the public health needs in India, there was an attempt a few years ago to compulsory license a drug for renal carcinoma, kidney cancer, of which almost nobody in India gets treated for. Now, is that their public health need? Is that their public health emergency? No, there was a company called Natco that wanted to produce the drug that a Western company was making. And they went to India government and said, we want a compulsory license to make a drug for renal carcinoma because there's a lot of money in that for us. And that's exactly the way they did it, almost exactly the words they put it in. Now, I'm willing to concede that there is
a 97% decrease of the price, by the way, that compulsory license will.
And Indian government lacked the money to pay for the patients in India with renal carcinoma. They lacked the money for that. That's what you're saying.
I was a bit mean in the way I framed the question, but we're now down to about 8 minutes, otherwise we lose our reception. So in the final comments that we've got room for, unless everybody wants to give up the food and drink that has been laid. No, definitely not. Are you willing to invite those who are not part of the industry, but those who are public sector policymakers, academics, non-governmental organizations working on healthcare, to tweak or work on the ecosystem in ways that might regulate it, restrict it, check it, change it, in order to get better outcomes that are not just about the decisions of the investors?
My plea would be...
and we're moving to final comments.
It's a very complex ecosystem. My plea would be, yes, let's look at it, but let's look at it together. I went to an event at Harvard Law School, I think you may have been there a couple of years ago, in which this was very much the topic. And there was me and I think one other person, I think from Gilead in their room representing industry. We were in the city that is the biggest biotech hub in the world. And there was nobody there from a small company saying, this is what I have to deal with every day in researching a medicine. This is what I have to deal with regulatory approval. This is how much it costs. This is how long it takes. There was nobody there. I mean, I'm not saying we have all the answers. I'm just saying what we know is this is what's working now. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about what is working. My plea is, please, let's just not spoil the incentives or undermine the incentives that people have for this huge amount of financing that's going to be necessary to produce the treatments and cures that we don't have now. I mean, we can talk about the medicines that we have. And the second thing is, I continue to believe that this IP debate is going to get increasingly sterile as more and more drugs become biologics and then move on to gene therapy, cell therapy, and gene editing. What we're talking about here on patents is just not going to be relevant. You're not going to be able to develop competitors that have this kind of proprietary knowledge. I mean, let me just give one example on this. That's not even a new technology. Let's look at insulin. Okay, it's a naturally occurring substance. Nobody has a patent on it. Everybody has insulin in their bodies, or most of us do. There's only 3 or 4 companies in the world. Yes, they're big companies. One's Danish, one's American, that produce insulin in a cost-effective way. And they make a profit on it, and they treat diabetics around the world. Anybody can make insulin. Anybody can. There's no patent on it. What these companies have is a cookbook this big that's proprietary information that represents 50 years of knowledge on how to make insulin. Okay? That's what we're looking at in the future. Is somebody has, it's not, the production is going to get so complicated, and so much research is going to go into figuring out how to make that product, that it's not good, you're not going to be able to simply say, you know what, get rid of the patent, compulsory license it, and then companies are going to sprout up all over the world and be able to compete with it. I don't believe that's going to happen in the future. And we need to be talking about that now, because it is going to be a problem. Because the compulsory license program, yeah, sabosvir is a small molecule. It's a chemical drug. You can have people around the world. Like an Egyptian company can make that pretty easily. Anybody can. But that's not the future we're looking at. And I would just say, let's start having those discussions now before, 10 or 15 years from now, we or our children don't have to come back and have the same discussion about why the system failed with respect to these new technologies, because we didn't have it in anticipation of that.
Last words, I'm afraid, a minute or so each. Patrick?
I'll defer.
No, I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think we have a lot of ideas of things we can progress on. So I don't know. I mean, I think I am very interested to talk with researchers, SMEs. And there are some discussions that are starting, maybe not in DC, but in some other places. There are a lot of possibilities in middle-income countries and many different countries in the global south, and where technology is being developed, and even complex technology, very complex technologies. So that, yeah, I mean, to go back to the main, your entry topic about China, yeah, for me, one of the big question is, okay, in places like DC, or dominant economies who are maybe not going to stay dominant but are still at the moment, people are very reluctant to look at different models because, of course, they see that as losing control and power. I think in other economies, we may find some people, policymakers, researchers, who are interested in working on different models. So maybe not China, I don't know, maybe some other countries. So we're actually already starting discussion with some people. So that's, I mean, from the perspective of a medical organization trying to get the innovation we need and provide it to the people who need it, we see opportunities, and we are optimistic in some ways, I would say.
Ruth, do you have a final word?
Yeah, I do. I mean, first let me say thank you to Matt and his team, and
Agree.
to Sean, who I was going to wring his neck for dragging me out here.
It's rainy night.
So there are actually at least two. I see Fred Abbott and Jerry Reichman, and I'm hoping that during the debate reception, lots of people will talk to them, because they have actually some fairly innovative and I think important contributions in the literature about ways to deal both with pricing and regulation, and the question of the Doha exceptions and flexibilities. So lots of experts in the room. So I think it's really important for the debate to continue. I do want to say something that I hope all of us will think about. And first, it's about China. I am concerned that we have created a monster, right? If anybody's concerned about what China's doing today, it's because China's been looking at the US. And it's a very sobering thing for a tool that was meant to be about innovation to be converted into a tool that is entirely about competitive advantage in the most disruptive way. It is not a sign of innovation that there are hundreds and thousands of patents being handed out every day. And the glut in the market is going to be extremely significant and add a layer of complexity that I think we all should be concerned about. I also think that there's a big difference between using the IP system really as a system that fuels innovation, provides certainty and credibility, and what happens when that same system is essentially a tool of industrial policy. I mean, that's part of what we're seeing in China. And it's a very different kind of framing at that point. This debate tonight has been about individual companies owning individual patents or portfolio of patents, and really at the policy level, people are looking at a system, right, as Patrick would say. And my last point is, to the extent that we see the frontier of innovation moving beyond just the IP model that we see today, that may not be a good thing. Lots of people can afford basic denim for jeans. Not everyone can afford designer jeans. And I think people who just want to be able to be healthy, to not have to deal with malaria, to not have to deal with cancer, to not have to deal with high blood pressure, the diseases that have taken a significant toll on human population in this generation, that may still remain the most pressing public health problem before we begin to think about the kind of gene therapies and personalized services that are important and really exciting to see, but that the vast majority of the world can't even begin to think about, because for so many of them, they're still dealing with HIV or with malaria or with infant mortality. So I myself believe that we cannot stop having this debate, that we have to continue to push and pull, literally, that we have to identify aspects and people and companies in the industry that are willing to try these new business models, that we need to begin to see a decoupling between political and financial partnerships between policymakers and the industry, that we need a lot more transparency about pricing, and that the range of tools should not be limited. I mean, I think if there's one thing that this debate has said tonight, is that we need a range of tools. And some tools that work in the cancer market will not work in the biotech market. And the tools that work in tropical diseases cannot work in other areas. And that means that this over-reliance on the patent system needs to be something that we're willing to begin to more critically explore.
You know, life has changed an awful lot in the last 300 years. And it's easy to forget how we got here, where we came from. You know, in just a few centuries, life expectancy has increased dramatically, first in Western countries, then in the Americas, and then in Asia and Africa. Maternal mortality has dropped dramatically all around the world. Infant mortality has dropped around the world. The United States, people historically didn't name their children before age 5 because the chances that they would live so long were so minimal. You could make the same case across dozens of statistics related to safety, violence, all aspects of human welfare. Life, where it was once nasty, brutish, and short, has become long, productive, and rewarding for many around the world, and many more every day. And the patent system is not the whole story there, obviously, but it's a big part of the story. It was a linchpin in creating an economic ecosystem where research wasn't just the privilege of a handful of rich aristocrats, but it became democratized. It was undertaken by everyday workmen, engineers who had ideas, ability to develop them, with the hope that at the end of the process, that if they came up with something, they would have a right and ability to sell it and go on and do the next thing and make a livelihood from it. And out of that has grown a system that has enabled long-term investments in high-risk activities leading to transformative innovation. Now, at GIPC, we always say that innovation happens everywhere, and it's true. People all around the world have the same inherent capacity for innovation. But innovation on a socially transformative scale has not happened everywhere. And it's largely emerged from economies like that in the United States that have protected intellectual property at a very high standard. And it's enabled the allocation of resources to these activities and the mobilization of many more resources to those activities. And to suggest that somehow this is an immoral activity is really quite stunning. And I find it disappointing, really, that discussions like this break down between what is essentially a socialist and a capitalist model. Ruth, you suggested that I was oversimplifying it. In fact, I think you're overcomplicating it. The fact is that if we create a system where investment can seek a return and innovative activity, it will come and it will continue to follow. And to get in the way of that without a rational alternative would be truly the immoral outcome.
I agree that it's complex. I do. I think it's complex, but I think life is complex. And I think we're not going to escape that.
Well, there's not much more to say. We live in a world where life expectancy and people's ability to prosper undoubtedly has gone up. We live in a very unequal world. We live in a world where it's possible to live in the same city and one's opportunities be very, very divergent. In different countries, the same applies, of course. So it's a very complicated world we live in, and the solutions we need are going to be complicated. We said we wanted to search for common ground. I'm not sure that we found the common ground. We at least restated our willingness to listen to each other and to work towards common ground. So hopefully this will be the beginnings of a process where we go on listening. And hopefully we are hearing the diversity of voices and the desire by everybody to create a better world from the point at which we start. Thanks very much to Georgetown and to the Global Congress for hosting this, and thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks for being part of the big debate.